concepts of literature, the concepts of humanities, university, and the communication systems. These are the contexts of production for our purpose today. We are talking about the context in which we are located, but at the same time we are talking about a certain kind of theme. And I'm saying that the theme, when we begin to unfold, we give more privilege to the context of production, where the theme has come from. And the theme of literature as a generic term, and it is an institutionalized concept, and then they call literature, and also the discourse within which, broader discourse within which literature is located, called the humanities, and the institution which allows us to teach this, and the communication media through which we do that. All these are a part of a context of production. We receive them. Those of us who are elsewhere, we happen to receive them. Okay? For us, the context of reception is India, and students from our regions, and teachers, institutions, and our native languages. Now, this is the kind of situation in which we are caught. When we talk about context, then we begin to unfold the context. We begin to see that we are caught in two positions, both as teachers, but also receivers, but both as givers, as well as kind of imparters and disseminators of a certain kind of understanding. But there is an asymmetric relationship. Okay, so the question that comes is that if Europe produced the discourses, institutions, media, and a concept, if it has done that, and if it has imparted that to another context of reception, whether India, Africa, or any other country, even Egypt, whichever the country we are talking about, the question that emerges is that how did these contexts interface? How did these respond? Did Europe respond to what it was encountering? Or how did the receiving context respond to what Europe has done? These questions come up, okay? Did India respond in our context? Did India respond to Europe from its own resources? Or India simply received it? These become both historically relevant and also contemporaneously relevant. I'm not talking about history alone. In post 1857, what happened? Though historical question is important, but I'm talking more about our own existential situation, because we're still caught in that kind of framework. Am I audible? Please let me know. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So the question comes up: was Europe at all sensitive at all to the context which it was invading with its own armor, if you like, with its own paraphernalia? Was it sensitive to these contexts? It becomes a crucial question. Now, it seems to me, from the kind of inquiries, I'm sure some of you are familiar, the interface between Europe and India was asymmetric. It was based on an asymmetric relationship. Europe imposed its frameworks of learning, its own kind of interpretation or understanding, which were aimed at a particular kind of purpose, which were driven by a particular kind of purpose to transform, as you know, the mindset of the natives, so that they will align with, they will go according to the demands of the empire. Okay? So, in the process, what Europe tends to do, not just in India, but in any other country, in Asia, in other countries, it has tended to do the same thing. It looks at the existing forms and modes of learning. So when Europe goes to another country, it looks at what is available there, but then either they are discarded, or they are kind of stigmatized, they are seen as inferior ones, and a certain kind of denigration of the local knowledges is inculcated in the local cultures. This is quite often what happens. Or something else it does. It tries to look at the local knowledges in terms of the frameworks and concepts and structures that Europe is familiar with. As a result, there is a certain kind of tremendous amount of transformation of what is available to the natives, that is to say, the context of reception. In our case, India. I'm assuming that all of you are from Indian background. Some of you may be from other places, but we will discuss that at a later point. You can raise questions. So this asymmetry gets actually programs. This asymmetry programs our educational systems. And these educational systems have been going on. Humanities education system is deeply structured by that, and other educational disciplines also have been privileging the context of production. We all know, as teachers of literature, We tend to talk about the author, the author's background, author's historical situation, the cultural context, the historical context, the economic, political context, in order to talk about the writer. And all these contexts, to a large extent, have come from Europe. But when we talk about India, when you talk about Ananthamurthy or Girish Karnad or any other writer, you tend to do the same thing. We tend to do the same thing. What is the historical background? What is the cultural background? So these backgrounds are projected. And this particular approach, this particular framing of the study of literature, okay, is something very peculiar, historically peculiar, both to Europe itself, but also the other cultures. That's the claim that I'm making. So it is not just with the discipline of literature, but the entire discourse of the humanities and every concept that we deal with. Take any concept that you have today prevalent in the university. Concept of philosophy, concept of the literary, concept of art, aesthetics, culture, religion, comparison, translation. All these have quintessentially, they have emerged from European reflections about European situation. Yet they get universalized, they get implanted in other cultures as if they are the ways in which humanity can think about itself, think about its past, think about its future. This is something very peculiar. This is the result of the asymmetry that I was referring to. The asymmetric relationship between context of production and context of reception. We, located paradoxically in the context of reception, we tend to act according to the programming that has been done. It looks like early in the morning a frustrated lesson in a new year, but I'll try to overcome that, and then we'll have something more to share. So consequently, what is the result of this kind of asymmetric programming? The result is a certain kind of psychic disjuncture. That is to say, our experiences are of a particular kind, our cultural forms and reflections are of one particular kind, and then but the ways to which we have to interpret them, the ways in which we have to understand them are very different. As a result, there is a certain kind of disjuncture between what we think and what we feel, what we have received from our immemorial past, and what we are being asked to, look upon, or the ways in which we need to interpret what we have received. There is a disjuncture. That powerful disjuncture continues even to this day. I can give you hundreds of examples to elaborate each of these points, but unfortunately time doesn't permit, but I'll give you a quick example. There is not a single figure in the domain of art and art history in India who has not derived from European heritage to talk about what is called Indian art, both the concept as well as interpretation. Number one. Number two, major thinkers of modern India who begin to talk about Sanskrit tradition and Sanskrit literary tradition, you would be surprised to know that they have totally derived their arguments from 19th century, some kind of, whose names we don't even remember now, 19th century literary critics of Europe. That's how they looked at Sanskrit tradition and then programmed Sanskrit tradition to understand literature in a particular way. This is the situation we are facing today. I'm not even talking about literature, English literature. The English literature story is a different one. But understanding of literature, that is to say, the literary works that exist in the native cultures, how they have to be understood, has been totally dominated by European understanding of European cultural forms. And we are programmed into, implementing them, implanting them, and through us, by means of us, these get replicated in our context. So the question comes, what are we doing? That question comes. But we need to know, we'll begin to realize when we begin to reflect on this. By the way, I'm not the first one to say this. There are many people who have said that. For example, K.C. Bhattacharya, several years ago, almost 100 years ago, said that, why is it, though we have been exposed to English literature, and European culture has come to us from English literature, through English literature, why is it we have not yet been in a position to respond to English literature from Indian sensibility? That's the word he uses. Why is it we are not able to do that? He's a philosopher. He raised this question. 100 years ago he raised. Occasionally people have been raising such questions, but then there is no concerted effort, definitely from literature, institutional literature, that is to say those teachers who are teaching literature, there is barely any kind of serious reflection on this. That's the unfortunate scenario in which we are caught. Let me not talk about philosophy. Philosophy is even more bankrupt, but that's a different story. So the question that comes to us is that the conceptual grid that I have identified earlier, that is to say, all the concepts in humanity that we deal with, concept of literature, art, religion, aesthetics, all these concepts, are they universal? Given the fact that they have been generated from Europe, describing European experience, describing European, unfolding of European mind, is the thinking of the humanity universally? Is the question that comes to us. When we begin to take a pause and begin to reflect, then we begin to see, okay? We are categorized as non-Europeans. I want to point out very clearly that the concept of non-Europe is very much a product of European thinking. There is nothing like non-Europe. Non-Europe is the other of Europe postulated or projected by Europe itself. What is not Europe is considered to be non-Europe. So the differences that you find in these heterogeneous cultures that spread across what is called non-Europe, those differences, those variations, get kind of ignored, and then we are totalized as non-European countries. Okay, so the challenge comes to us is that our institutionally, we are yet to prepare ourselves to confront this kind of asymmetry and a certain kind of disjunctive scenario in which we are caught, and then we can continue to perpetuate. So we need to ask the question, what can be done from within the context in which we are located? We are located in very diverse kind of contexts, as you all know. So a question we have to ask is that each one of us in each one of our situations will have to confront this question, and that question is, for some time to come, will remain a very, very significant kind of question. What do we do with what we have? So we need to understand whether we have anything and what can be done with these things, whether you can do anything. A whole range of questions come when we begin to meditate on this question. It seems to me that from both teaching and then inquiring, along with students and along with other colleagues, I get the feeling that we are caught in a certain kind of double bind. Double bind is that by pointing out that Europe has asymmetrically implanted us in a certain kind of institutional situation, I'm not recommending that we get rid of the institutions. We should stop teaching literature. I'm not recommending that kind of thing at all. We need to remain, because we don't have any alternative at this stage, we need to remain in the situation in which we are. Historical violence that has been perpetrated, we recognize the violence, we continue to teach in the same institutions, continue to teach what is called literature. And at the same time, we know that when we teach this, when we impart this, that denies us. We are imparting something that denies us. Because the interpretive modes, the concepts, they're all received ones without any kind of response to them. So we are caught in a double bind. We can't get rid of it, but when we want to implement it, it seems to erase our identity. It seems to erase our own kind of significance. That's a double bind. We can't live without it, and when we live with it, it kind of takes away our life, as it were. That's the double bind. Caught in the double bind, that is located within the discourses, located within the institutional structure, we need to make a double move. What is the double move here? Caught in a double bind, we make a double move. We need to dance in the double bind. How do we do the dance? The dance is very, easy to say but difficult to practice. The dance is that we make use of European structures which have been implanted among us. We study European literature, European conceptual categories. We need to study them, not in order to interpret ourselves, but to understand Europe. That is to say, Europe develops a concept called literature, spreads across the world. Europe develops a concept called university. Europe develops a concept called religion. And then it says that every culture has religion, every culture needs literature, every culture has literature, every culture needs educational institutions. So, these concepts are imposed on them. What we try to do is that we look at these concepts in order to try to understand Europe. What kind of culture would this be which would generate such kind of concepts? Our question must be, what kind of culture can it be? If such kind of concepts are not there in our cultures, what kind of culture would generate such concepts? For example, take the concept of humanities. India does not have a concept of humanities. That does not mean that India has some kind of lack. India has some kind of disability as such. Not that disabilities are bad, but the point is that India has some kind of mental defect as such. No. We have to ask the question, instead of feeling defensive about it, we need to ask the question, what kind of culture is it that generates a discourse called humanities? So we need to turn the resources that are implanted in us, we need to turn them against their grain and try to understand the kind of background from which such kind of concepts have come to us. So European channels will have to be used to understand Europe. That's one kind of thing. Second move, I said that double move in the double bind. The second move that we need to make is that we need to struggle to find out what is it that cultural forms of your location indicate. What is it that they suggest? What is it that they intimate you with in the languages that are available to you? That is to say, we must take the risk of trying to configure what this particular cultural background is from which we come, or the cultural background that has made us. These are the two moves that we need to make caught in the double bind. We remain in the universities, we teach the literary discourse, yet we ask a different kind of question. Why does Europe do this? Why does Europe develop humanities as a category in a particular historical moment in its history? Why is it other cultures don't have? Such questions will open up new researches, such questions open up more invigorating kind of teaching and research in our context. Okay? Now, as you know, what I try to do in the coming slides, I don't want to run out of time, I just want to see, because there's always teachers have a problem. Okay, what I try to do in the next first few steps, what I try to point out is that the context in which you are located and the asymmetry of this context and how it works through us. Now, this looks like a very frustrating kind of lesson, but then this is only a preamble, a certain kind of introduction to point out that what can we do in our situations. Now I try to point out in the next few kind of slides, I try to point out what are the ways in which you can begin to explore in the particular context in which you are located. Now, we know that every culture, whatever the culture you come from, irrespective of whatever the location you are in, you may be in Amazonian forest, or you may be in Philippines, or whatever the country you come from. If there is a word called culture, and if that word creates, or rather that culture creates something, then a certain kind of media are at work there. That is to say, every culture articulates itself by means of certain specific media. These media are of various kinds, okay? And these are roughly, for the purpose of inquiry, we identified them to be 5 different media. You can't think about a culture which does not work with a certain kind of media, okay? Irrespective of whether they have literacy or not, okay? So what are these media? These are the first communicational medium that we come across is oral and gestural. They generate cultural forms called song and culture. What I'm sketching here is a certain kind of universal situation. That is that any culture, anywhere, articulates itself by means of some specific kind of communicational medium, or specific kind of cultural technologies, or certain kind of techniques, okay? So oral and gestural are the most ancient ones. There's no culture which does not pass through that, which does not continue to sustain it, okay? I'm involved in, for instance, oral now, okay? And gestural. Whereas you are involved in scribal. Some of you are taking notes, I can see. So you are involved in scribal communication system. So oral and gestural ones are the primary ones. They get displaced by scribal ones. Scribal gets displaced by print, and print gets displaced by audiovisual, and that gets displaced by digital, okay? So cultural technologies, all these are called cultural technologies. Each cultural technology generates a specific kind of cultural form, okay? One gets displaced by another one. They do not get eradicated, but they get displaced, okay? So we begin to see that any kind of reflection, any kind of knowledge, any kind of wisdom, any kind of learning of expression of ideas will have to fall back upon some kind or other kind of cultural technology or communicational medium. It is not possible for us to think about cultural expression without communicational media. Okay? So now why am I talking about this? Now, we were talking about earlier, if you remember, just a few minutes ago, that we need to find out something called cultural difference. Why is it a culture called Europe generates a certain kind of concepts which are not available in other cultures? And then why is it such concepts are not available in other cultures? So what we are confronted with is that if there is an asymmetry between Europe and India, there must be difference in their cultural perceptions and cultural work. If that is the case, how do we find out cultural difference? That's the question that comes out. That is that a culture generates very powerful concepts and then forcefully imposes these concepts on all the cultures and makes them feel that this is the way things go. Then we have to ask the question, why is it other cultures don't do that? Why is it China, which is much, much older than Europe, or India, which is much, much older than Europe? Okay? Why is it these cultures did not develop such concepts and impose them on other cultures? Why is it Europe's concepts get developed and then they get imposed on other cultures? Such questions come up. One way of doing that from within our context, that is university and discourse, is to explore what is called cultural difference. How do cultures differ? One of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways of exploring cultural difference is to see what kind of cultural technology or communicational medium a particular culture gives preference to. That is to say, that to differentiate Europe from India, what I am claiming is that take a look at the cultural media or communicational systems which one culture gives privilege to and another culture doesn't. That may be one way of exploring cultural difference. When we say that, after having said that, we identified 5 different kind of communicational media. Now we begin to see there is a possibility of dividing even these 5 into 2 manageable categories. One is that scribal, print, audiovisual, digital. They all belong to one particular kind of set. They are all inscriptional media. They are all inscriptional media. Means you write something. In order to write, you need a surface, you need a writing system, and you need a recording system. All these are required. Okay? For print you need, for audiovisual you need, for digital also you need computer, you need a chip. All these are required. So these are all inscriptional systems. Whereas the oral and gestural is not an inscriptional system. It does not require a surface on which you write something, externalize it. You don't require it. The first one is something that I describe as Nemo culture, M-N-E-M-O. Nemo is memory cultures or cultures of memory. The other ones I describe as a certain kind of inscriptional cultures. Non-inscriptional cultures and inscriptional cultures. There is a significant difference between non-inscriptional cultures and inscriptional cultures. Okay? So the challenging question that comes up is that what happens when non-inscriptional cultures are invaded by inscriptional cultures? Yeah? What results when non-inscriptional cultures invade inscriptional cultures? As we all know, all cultures to start with, irrespective of which culture, whichever the culture we are dealing with, all cultures are mnemocultural to start with. They did not begin with writing. They began with speech and gesture. All cultures to start with are mnemocultural. But then at some point in certain kind of culture, some other kind of communication system develops and it gains prominence. Whereas similar kind of history, similar kind of evolution does not take place in other cultures, even when they are exposed to other kind of cultural media. And that distinguishes one culture from another culture. The importance that was given to inscription in European culture is radically different from the importance that inscription gains in other cultures like China, India, and to a certain extent, Arabia. Yeah, so there is a very significant difference. Cultural differences can be explored on the basis of communicational technologies or communicational media. Okay, so Europe, it is unthinkable for Christianity to develop without inscription. Okay, it is unthinkable for Vedic culture to develop with inscription. That's a paradox that you will see. Okay. So what we are talking about is that if culture is memory, this memory gets articulated. We are studying memory as it were. Memory manifests in terms of memory brings forth cultural forms. These cultural forms are brought forth by means of communicational systems, cultural technologies. These range from oral to digital. Now, the non-inscriptional cultures or nemocultures are what I described as Elithic cultures because they involve a substrate, a hard surface that is called lithic culture. Inscriptional cultures are lithic cultures. The entire work that is available today in the world, as I am speaking to you, every significant theoretical work that is available to you today, from Plato to Jacques Derrida and then Stiegler, okay, the work that is available is largely and entirely based on lithic cultures. They try to understand European theories of memory, try to understand nemocultures on the basis of inscriptional cultures. That's the paradox that's available to us to this day. There is no response to lithic cultures from Elithic background. There is no response to inscriptional cultures from non-inscriptional cultures. Okay, this I was talking about. To point out cultural difference. What was the situation in ancient cultures when writing began to become important? So memory. I quickly run through this because there are other things that I want to talk to you about. Okay, in Greek culture, for instance, memory and muses were inseparable. And memory, it is the muses who inspired the bard, and the bard is the singer, and the singer can think about the future, past, and present without definitively fixating himself on one particular moment of time, and can address any context. That's the work of the muse. That's the work of the bard. Bard is a kind of visionary. The visionary has been inspired by muses, and he begins to compose something, and the composition itself is not really the product of his own kind of conscious will, as it were. It is unthinkable for the bard like Homer to understand what this is. Okay, so they sang about the past, present, and future. Okay, and then the body becomes important. It is by means of the body in nemocultures, the body actually articulates the memory. It is not the surrogate body. That is to say, when memory is exported to an external apparatus, whether book or notebook in both the senses, or print medium, then your memory gets externalized and retained outside the body. Whereas in the traditional cultures, like Greek culture or Arabic culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, you begin to see that memory is embodied. It is always enacted. You sing. When you sing and perform, your body is at work. It is through the body that the memory gets articulated and replenished constantly. This is a distinction. And in Greek culture, basically the master of truth, the considered to be the one who is capable of handling truth, is considered to be the bard, apart from others like king of justice and then visionary, diviner. But bard was considered to be the most important figure. Okay, he dealt with truth. The Greek word for truth is aletheia. Aletheia means both. It involves two kind of activities: concealing and unconcealing, hiding and disclosing. Both these. So the bard acted upon both these aspects of the work. Okay. So whether the bardic articulation, the song that the singer sang, the Homer sang, whether it is dealing with only truth or whether it is dealing with untruth. So the claim that they would make is that reality in which we exist always is composed of truth and untruth. Our world and our existence is permeated by truth and untruth. Try to know that. That's the point that they were trying to make. They did not unilaterally privilege something called truth as non-contradictory, truth as visible. Such kind of concepts did not emerge in ancient Greek cultures. This gets the concept of literature that we work with today. The concept of literature is unthinkable in Greek culture. The origins of literature that has been institutionalized is not Greek at all. Okay? It is neither Greek nor Latin nor what is called non-European. Chinese, Arabic, African, none of these cultures could have had the concept of literature. They could not have developed it. Okay? This is not what I'm saying. This is a major European thinkers. I will reveal the star cast in a minute. But these thinkers tend to think that conceptual literature is unthinkable in outside European culture. Okay? Take the case of Chinese. If conceptual literature was unavailable to Greeks, take a nation culture like Chinese. They had no concept at all. These concepts called literature and philosophy were completely absent in Chinese culture. Their encounter with Europeans was in the 17th century. Jesuits went to China and then began to translate their work. But then in the 19th century, you begin to see a new term gets coined, a neologism gets coined called "siu-siu," and that is described as a equivalent to Chinese equivalent to European concept of philosophy. Why is it philosophy? I'm referring to philosophy? Within Greek culture, the bard gets displaced at a particular historical time by a tribe of philosophers. The philosophers claim that they are the masters of truth. The bard is a liar, philosopher is the truth teller. That gets established in Greek culture towards the later part. In the 3rd century, 4th century BC onwards, this transformation begins to take place in Greek culture. Such thing you will not come across in Chinese. Chinese culture was exposed to writing, but that writing did not evolve into, that writing did not result in the consequences that it has had in European culture. European culture segregates, suppresses, marginalizes nemo-cultures. Marginalization of nemo-cultures is undermining of the body, discarding of the body, treating the body as only a mere instrument, and depending on the surrogate bodies. That is to say, archives, libraries, museums, databases, whole range of other things become more important. As you can see in contemporary Europe and elsewhere, these become very important kind of institutions. China did not have a concept of literature at all, though they had very, very ancient, 1,000-year-old concept. 1,000 means 3,000-year-old, 1,000 BC. A notion called shi. Shi means, kind of song. Song sung and handed down by the sages of ancient times. And a lovely thing, this story is fascinating, but unfortunately time doesn't allow me to elaborate this. Each of these actually, Chinese ones we could spend a semester talking about it. But unfortunately, we don't have time. So the point I'm trying to make is that though they had poetry, though they had drama, though they had stories, though they had lyrics, none of these were considered to be literature. And literature, these are not literature. These are something very different. Okay? And number one. Number two, nobody tried to, interpret these kind of songs, song cultures, or story traditions in terms of a particular kind of discourse. That is something that was absent in many. Chinese case is different, but this can be discussed as a commentatorial tradition that developed in China, but we can't get into that at this stage. So the major figures of Chinese culture who always made use of songs, they would recite the songs in their discourses. When they're talking to other people, from time to time, they would cite a song. This is something very familiar to us, especially when you come from Urdu background. I come from such kind of background in Hyderabad and Warangal, where I've grown up and then studied. So you begin to see that not now, just at least 2-3 decades ago, you utter a few sentences and a shairi comes in. So you're always drawing on poetic traditions, poetic lines in order to complete your sentence. Okay, your sentence is never a complete prose sentence. It is interrupted always or supplemented constantly by poetic lines. Now, such poetic lines are not considered to be literature. That's the strange kind of thing that we come across. What about Arabic culture? Yeah, there are part of Semitic cultures. Shemites are children of Abraham, and then this goes much further, Noah's children, and then Arabia was under one of the sons of Abraham. Noah's sons, and but these were the Bedouin tribes. Bedouin tribes were nomadic people, moved across deserts, but they had a very powerful singing tradition. Seer or Shire or kind of Sher. I'm sure many of you pronounce them much better way. These are nomadic desert songs, and these are sung by specific kind of tribes. and which the term meant simply, they did not have elaborate narratives, but they would sing on very specific occasions. They would have a kind of a certain kind of competition also in various places, like before Makkah became a religious center of one particular religion. It was a place which was a trade center, which was also a pilgrim center, where performances used to take place, and then each tribe would have its own poet, and each tribe would have its own singer. They would sing. These singers were inspired by jinns, kind of spirits, if you like. And then they would pass on some kind of, like the bards in Greek culture. There is some striking similarity with the bards of Greek culture and then the shires of Arabic culture. So this tradition went on, but that gets appropriated into Islam, and then there's a very interesting story there. So the shire in Arabic culture did not develop a long epic poem as such, as in the case of Greeks. They would have a kind of valorous story about a leader, or a love story, or about a certain kind of poignant account and song, love song about his beloved left behind. Okay, so or an adventure that they're going to undertake. These were about either master's hospitality, the way one would, or a bailer, or some kind of power. So these are various themes, and they would weave song traditions called Qasida. Some of you are certainly familiar with, and our Indian film songs are full of these words. Remember my Shire Donahi. So Shire is a word which we are all familiar with, a poet. Okay. Qasida has a three-part structure. I'm tempted to talk more about it, but we don't have time, unfortunately. And this three-part structure is about, about introduction, about erotic theme, and the journey that one takes up, and also the destination that one reaches. And these are the poets has the liberty to actually develop one particular part of this particular song and then spread it across. Okay? The importance of song is not in recording of it, not in a recorded rendering of it, but in recitation of it, in performance of it. Ravis used to perform. They tried a particular group called Ravis. They used to perform these songs. When the song pleases you in its performance, that becomes important. So what we're dealing with is a particular kind of performative song cultures. So performative song cultures existed, but they did not turn themselves into what is called literature. The concept called literature that gets institutionalized has a very specific background. It has nothing to do with really, quite often when we teach Plato's Republic, book 10, we tend to talk about ancient battle between philosophers and poets, and then the poets were overcome by the philosophers, and it's a battle between Muthos and Logos. All that story is very interesting, very fascinating. But what is important is that the source of what is called literature is not really Greek, nor is it Latin, nor is it Sanskrit or Chinese. It is entirely Judaic, a very Judaic. And this is traced back in contemporary theory. It is traced back to a certain kind of covenant, a certain kind of agreement that emerges between God and Abraham, the patriarch. That compact, that secret, that secrecy, the secrecy is the source of what is called literature. And that the covenant is a certain kind of law, a covenant is a certain kind of legal agreement between God and Abraham. What is the agreement about? That Abraham would sacrifice his son, his most beloved and only son, Isaac. Okay? He would sacrifice him. And but he does not reveal. Abraham would not reveal to his wife Sarah, nor to any other people, what he is going to do. And that secrecy is the essence of literature. Literature seems to say something, but does not say anything. It does not say everything. It says, but doesn't say. So there is always some kind of concealment, even when it is trying to say something. That duality, that strange kind of combination of revelation, revealing something, but concealing, which is the result of a certain kind of agreement, a certain kind of legal binding between a subject and a sovereign. sovereign is God here, subject is Abraham here. It is that structure which is seen to be the basis of literature. And what I am talking about here is the major argument developed by Derrida. Like Derrida argues that it is not possible to find literature as a concept emerging from any other culture except in Judaic culture. Okay? And I would say Judeo-Christian. Derrida does, I mean, I could have spent the rest of the class talking about Derrida, but time doesn't allow. I want to cover something else. We are running out of time. We are running out of time. We are running out of time. I want to point out that Derrida is trying to turn the concept of literature into a Judeo-Christian concept, totally Judeo-Christian concept. So he traces it back to the ancient Judaism on the one hand, as a result of the covenant between Abraham and God, and then a repetition of that in Christian era in the 18th century by this major philosopher called Kant. Kant, without Kant and then Abraham, you do not have a concept of literature. That's the kind of gist of Derrida's argument. And it's a very fascinating and provocative one. He makes this point without being negative about nothing. The concept of literature is a legal concept, and the legal concept is something that is enabled by only very specific kind of culture, and that's a theological culture that generates it. Okay, this is the argument that Derrida develops. And then this can be demonstrated. Actually, I would have loved to spend a semester talking about it, which I'm doing right now, but time prevents me from going this any further. So over the last 200 years, and also over the 2 millennia, Semitic cultural traditions have spread across. When I say Semitic, the most important among the Semitic here for our purposes is Christianity. Christianity became the most powerful Semitic representative, and it developed concepts. These concepts have gone across the world. They have been imposed, sometimes persuasively, sometimes coercively, and we are caught in that one. Our institutions and our practices are full of that. When you come to non-European cultures, so-called non-European cultures like Indian, where I have already made the claim that Nemo cultures are at work. Many cultures, European cultures have given importance to inscription, whereas non-European cultures, even when they were exposed to inscription, like Chinese or Indian, they did not take recourse to inscriptionality. Something else is at work. So all our cultural traditions, when you look at Sanskrit, it is called Vangmaya. I'm sure many of you know the word. Vangmaya is pervasive utterance. Vak, Maya, pervasive utterance. Okay? So all our poetic traditions, reflective traditions like Shruti and Smriti and a whole range of others are the result of Vangmaya. They are a part of Vangmaya. They create the Vangmaya. They are uttered, they are recited, they are performed. They are always kind of rendered, bodily. That becomes very significant. These are all performative traditions. And the non-European, so-called non-European cultures, Asian and mainly Indian, I'm talking about, they have developed countless number of cultural forms through which these new cultural forms get articulated. Even when they have confronted writing came to us nearly 2,000 years after Indian reflective traditions have developed. From around, if we like, 1800 BC onwards, if Indian reflective forms have developed, cultural forms have developed, there is Vedas and other things. If they have developed, it is only in the Common Era, more or less, or just a little before Common Era. From Ashoka onwards, we begin to see writing becoming available in India. So more than 1,500 years, even when writing was available around, Indian reflective traditions did not take recourse to. Actually, the Indian experience of memory undermines totally the major claims made by European thinkers and European historians even to this day, that grammar is not possible without writing. This is one of the claims Europe makes. Grammar is not possible, logic is not possible, philosophy is not possible, science is not possible, legality is not possible without writing. This is the claim that major European thinkers have made, including Derrida, who supports this argument. Indian cultural experience proves that all these are wrong. Grammar was available, something called Vyakarana. Vyakarana was available without recourse to writing. You can think about Panini even to this day without taking recourse to writing. Panini is taught in many of the classes without textbooks. Okay? So you can think about whole range of kalpas, that is that kind of a geometric science, if you like, or astronomical science. Ganita Jyotisha is one of the disciplines which is computative or what's called computational astronomy. Computational astronomy developed without recourse to writing. So syndicate, but they get marginalized, they get sidelined, and then dominant cultural conceptions and dominant reflections and memory begin to get institutionalized. That's something that we are facing. Okay. In the Indian case, all the cultural forms that are available, which are largely performative, they're all very specific. They're generated by very specific cultural formations. In India, it is impossible to think about culture without the work of multiple kind of cultural formations. Cultural formations are really biocultural formations. They're the jatis and janjatis. What we call cultural forms of India that are available to us are generated for millennia by these multiple jatis. But Europe comes and tells us this jati is the most obnoxious term, we should get rid of it. If you get rid of jati, you have gotten rid of India's millennial culture. That's a significant thing that we need to remember. Okay? Not that there is no oppression, not that there is no injustice. There is no culture without injustice. That does not mean we are justifying injustice. But we need to be careful. If a culture has sustained itself and there is something like culture is available in a particular region and that culture is made possible by multiple jatis and janjatis, if you get rid of the jatis and janjatis, your culture also disappears. Okay? That's what is something that we are facing today. But what these cultures have done in multiple ways, in myriad ways, in countless number of ways, have generated distinctive kind of idioms, distinctive kind of languages, distinctive performative traditions, distinctive narrative traditions, distinctive dramatic traditions, visual traditions. And then all kinds of cultural forms have come into existence through these. These cannot be, kind of measured simply against anything. So that's something that's the deeper problem that we continue to confront in Indian situation. Indian situation for us to undertake researches. Why am I talking about India? As I pointed out at the very beginning, the context of reception is important. We need to make a double move in the double bind. Okay? The double bind is our institution called literature, our institution called university, our discourse called literature. Double move is that how do we try to understand European discourses on the basis of, we try to understand Europe on the basis of European discourses. We take the risk and configure what is considered to be our context of reception. That's the reason why I'm referring to India. Okay? So, Indian tradition for millennia has posed challenges. Very strange kind of challenges. Okay? It tries to generalize, but it doesn't seem to generalize. Okay? It is a generalization is a prerogative of philosophy. India, I would argue, did not develop, crystallize something called a philosophy, a discourse of philosophy as Europe did. And Europe itself claims, both Heidegger and Derrida and many other European philosophers have claimed that there is only one philosophy, which is called European philosophy. There's nothing else. Okay? But we are not defensively pointing out that way. What we are saying is that thinking and reflection and creation has worked in this culture in a radical way. Okay? Image making, very strange. India was non-plastic, non-pigmental for nearly 2 millennia. That is that painting and sculpture did not develop in India nearly for 1,500 years after its cultural forms have developed. Other cultural forms have developed. Emo cultures did not lend themselves to pigmental cultures or plastic cultures, painting and then sculpture and architecture. These emerged post-Ashokan period. Okay? It's a very strange kind of thing. But India did not impose any kind of, as the case of Judaism, that you should not create graven images. We don't have any injunction against creation of images, but India did not develop. These remain questions that need to be inquired into. There are no answers out there. No researchers has undertaken or even addressed for these questions. As I said, that India is nemocultural. All its cultural forms are nemocultural. Yet, the kind of manuscript output that India has generated ever since it was exposed to writing exceeds by 1,000 times the European, all writing that is available in European culture. Again, it's an enigma. It's a nemocultural one predominantly, yet it produces manuscripts. How does one understand this paradox? These are the challenging questions for new researchers. Another important thing, we have all disciplines of translation studies, comparative literature, all kinds of things. And then we as teachers of literature practice criticism. None of these is available in Indian traditions. Indian reflective traditions did not lend themselves to translation. Sanskrit did not translate for millennia. It did not. But Sanskrit lent itself to translation. That is to say, though Sanskrit language was exposed to other cultures and other languages, like Chinese, for instance, it did not undertake to translate Chinese work into Indian. Very rare, rarest of rare exceptions, one or two may be there, but even that is doubtful. Okay, so it did not translate. Whereas Sanskrit work that was available in and created by Buddhists, that was translated into Sanskrit. Sanskrit lent itself to translation, but it did not itself translate. Okay, and this is a very strange kind of paradox that. In the 19th century, Europeans thought that India is the mother of all translations, all stories. Narrative tradition is profuse in India. Indian tradition, again, one can argue, these are, again, research issues that need to be developed. And it is not, narrative was not given importance in Indian traditions, Indian cultural forms. Narrative is less important. Not that narratives are not there. It is replete with narratives, but narrative impulse or narrative imperative is less significant in Indian tradition. That's a very strange kind of thing. Okay? Again, our domination of context of production has not enabled us to reflect on these and open up new kind of inquiries. Why does one culture does not translate? Why is it so? The theory of translation that is available to us today, the theory of art, the theory of translation, the theory of criticism, the theory of literature that is available, all are the results of European thinking, even to this day. We continue to quote from European thinkers and tend to think that, okay, that is applicable in our case also. What we have done in the last 200 years is find equivalent to European terms and European ideas. That's what we have done. And we forced our languages to conform to European concepts. That's what we have done. So we perpetuate the violence that has been introduced by Europeans. That continues to happen today. Okay? There are multiple cultural formations that coexist, multiple languages coexist, but you do not find in ancient literature, even in medieval period, you do not find any kind of comparative impulse. Nobody tried to compare Kalidasa with Bhavabhuti. Nobody tried to compare one Upanishad with another Upanishad. Nobody tried to compare one Dharmashastra with another Dharmashastra, one Kavya with another Kavya. That did not happen. No jati compares itself with another jati. That is even to this day that is true. Okay? So there's a very strange scenario that we are caught in. Okay? Another major thing which hits at the root of the idea of criticism that we practice today is that Indian cultural forms and traditions did not develop, did not lend themselves to the creation of the discourse of the addressee, the listener's discourse. I recite a poem, you listen to it, you do not in turn write a discourse and then tell me what my poem is about. The addressee's discourse. I see a painting, I go to a temple, I see the sculpture, I do not end up writing a discourse about painting and culture, a sculpture, the way Hegel did in a kind of magisterial way. We don't do that. The discourse of the addressee is absent. So we have the concept, we have the idea of what we call Rasika or Sahridaya, but you do not have a discourse of the Rasika or Sahridaya. Unless the Rasikas and Sahridayas are themselves the poets. If they are poets, they write a poem. Or they compose a play. But they do not write a discourse. As a result, you do not have a discourse called, this tradition did not lend itself to a in this course called criticism. What we call literary criticism is an account about poetry, about a drama, about a kind of story. That's what we do. So we have to ask the question, what is the epistemic position? What is the position of knowledge? What is the position of learning of these disciplines in Indian traditions? If they are not there, they must be articulating a different response to cultural forms. How do we begin to connect ourselves to that and generate new ways of responding to literature, whether it is European literature or any literature? Those remain the challenging kind of questions, okay? And then we do not have the kind of vertical divide between philosophy and literature, which is an ancient one in European case. No Shastra divides itself and pits itself against Kavya. Kavya and Shastra go together. Again, I can spend quite a lot of time talking about this, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. I need to leave some time for you for questions. So these are the most challenging kind of questions that we come across. But then, as I pointed out earlier, in the Indian situation, if cultural forms have been generated by distinctive kind of communities, and these communities sustain their memories through some kind of what I call the guardians of memory of that particular community, these guardians spread across all over India, they keep on asking, being in your modern university is fine. You're studying what you think as the greatest literature of the world. But how do you respond to us? Yeah, without imposing your own kind of parameters on us. That's a challenge that these guardians pose us. The Janas, that is the Jatis and Janjatis, keep on asking us, what is the point of your learning? Can you tell us? Can you begin to communicate with us without imposing yourself on us? Extend the scene to the larger context. The whole Asia asks us. From these multiple Jatis and Janjatis of Asia, they keep on asking us. Our cultural forms we have sustained, our memories we have guarded over millennia. We have reared you, your entire body, and then your learning, your thinking, everything is something that we nurture. Yeah, your chromosomes and corpuscles have been made by us. How do you respond to us? How do you communicate to us? Those challenges remain. Cultural challenges continue to haunt us as long as we are kind of covered over by inscriptional technologies. That continues to happen even to this day. So what we need to do is, from the context of reception, we need to ask different set of questions. We need to make the double move within the double bind. And for that, we need to begin to be responsive to biocultural formations that surround us. There is no region in India which is not surfeit with biocultural formation and their cultural forms. Okay? I come from Telangana. There are Muharram songs here. And then there are all kinds of other song cultures. There are strange kind of combinations of jatis and their cultural forms. These are all, sort of crying out, challenging us from the outside the portals of the university. How do you respond? What's the point of your learning? That question keeps on haunting us. And so to transform that, to retain the institution, but transform it, to respond to Europe, what we need to do is we need to respond to our context. We need to transform our teaching. We need to transform our research. New courses will have to be generated. Programs will have to be transformed. And then involvement of the teachers, students, and everything will have to a radical fundamental transformation of our institutions and our practices will have to happen. Without that transformative practice is what we describe as critical humanities. It regards humanities, but it critically unravels it from the reception, ends of reception. Okay? And so the final challenge that remains is that, given the fact that we too have something from our context of reception, so we are asking what can be done from our context of reception to what we receive from the context of production. That question and that inquiry remains, and it cannot be developed by an individual or nor by a single institution, but every individual and every institution collaboratively and individually only can develop it. And it was our responsibility, both as teachers and learners, to undertake that. And I'm actually involved in that and sharing this with everybody. Like the ancient mariner, I keep telling this story to people, friends, students, and everybody. I thank you for your patience, and I'm open to your question. Thank you.
Sir, may I ask you one question?
Yes, please.
Sir, as you have described about Sanskrit literature, that there are so many Upanishads, Puran, Shruti as well as, and they are not translated even into any form. So, is it possibilities or any future for the research work of these work of Sanskrit literature into English?
Of course, there is. We need to do that. But what? Please mute your
the
mic.
possibilities, how we can start?
There are various ways in which this can be done.
Sir,
You need to mute your mic.
Me too?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Sir, actually being a student of Sanskrit literature also, I have a keen literature in Sanskrit. So, as I have heard your lecture that I have such a some intuition that I can do in this site also. So, how I could start to do this work? I am so much motivated by you for Sanskrit literature.
Okay.
So, sir,
Are you?
please, point out.
Please, I'll share my email with you. I can't do that now. I can share my email with you, and then you can correspond with me. And
Okay,
actually,
sir,
I work
can
in
share my
Alankara
email.
Shastra. I work in Alankara Shastra also.
Okay, sir.
But we can do that.
Sir,
Sure. Please do contact.
definitely. Sir,
Yes.
please.
Yes. Yeah.
Good morning, sir. Could I put my
Yeah, morning.
question?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your informative lecture, sir. So I had a question. You talked about discourse of the addressee. It's not present in
Correct.
mnemonic cultures. So I would like to
Yes.
ask whether this does not, cancel out response. Does it encourage passive reception? As in, is criticism necessarily something that is that should be treated as something reductive or negative, and should, in case there are any unequal any formulations in certain cultural products which might embody inequality or encourage it, should that not be challenged? So this is my question.
Okay, I understand part of the question. It's an important question. Sure, I think there are two questions involved in that. If I got you right, one is that should we undermine existing forms of criticism, right? No, we don't need to. We are trained in this institution, which is given to us by Europeans. But in examining this tradition, we also engage with Indian tradition. Are you from English literature background or
Yes,
what
sir,
language?
I am from English literature background, and sorry, sir, I would like to correct a bit. I was not asking about the Western tradition. I was
Okay.
talking
Okay.
about. You had mentioned mnemonic cultures, and you have been talking about Indian context, and you had said that there is no concept of the discourse of the addressee. That there
Yes.
is the concept of Rasika and Sahridaya, but
Yes.
there isn't a concept of the discourse of the addressee, that you can't go and criticize that, you can't write a discourse on how you receive. So does that this person who is hearing, and does if somebody is being left out of the discourse, they can't go and undermine that something that feels hierarchical.
Okay. Okay. Got it. I understand. Now, when I said the discourse of the Rasika or Sahridaya is something that does not exist as a kind of autonomous privileged discourse as it happens in European case. Okay. There is absence of that. But I also qualified. Rasika and Sahridaya can respond by generating another kind of poem or a play, another kriti, as we call in Sanskrit. Okay, that is to say, another cultural form can be generated. So your response comes in the form of generating another cultural form. For example, most of our in Indian languages, most of our cultural heritage is based on rendering what is available in Sanskrit into Indian languages. like Mahabharata, Ramayana, Kavyas. These have been rendered into Indian languages. Now they have not, I'm using the word rendered more cautiously, they're not translations as such. These have been, kind of received, and then the locals, that is the people from these languages, have responded to them by commenting on them. But the commentary remains within a kavya. It does not exist autonomously as a separate discourse. Okay? So there is no asymmetry as such. If you deeply feel responsive with regard to a kavya or any particular cultural form, you respond to that by creating another one. That you do. And we know that there were goshtis. One can talk a lot more about it. There were goshtis, but the no goshti was actually, the information about goshtis is not available to us historically. Okay? But the goshti discussion was not turned into a kind of discourse later on, like a Platonic dialogue. Nobody has undertaken that kind of writing. There are works where references to goshtis is available. Goshti is one way you perform your creation, you render your creation and then receive criticisms. And this is very, very rigorous one, that too, in Indian tradition. Okay, but we don't have a discourse about that, as far as I know. Okay? So,
that we can question through performative, or
absolutely, that has been done. That's been done in various places. I'll give you one example. I don't know which region you come from. Kumaravyasa, for instance, in Karnataka, he calls himself Kumaravyasa, and he says, I am right better than Vyasa, which is better than Vyasa's Mahabharata. Well, there are many instances of that kind. Okay? So we come across that. It is never a passive reception. The Telugu rendering of Mahabharata is distinct from Sanskrit rendering. The Malayalam rendering of Bhagavata is different from some other kind of thing. Yeah, so there is a distinction. This is fascinating. Yeah, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, sir. Sir, I am Shaukat Ali. Hello, sir.
Yes, please.
Sir, I am Shaukat Ali from Kashmir. Sir, actually my point is that even though we are living in a post-colonial period, but we have not been able to shut out the embedded neo-colonialism in us. Because I have my personal example. So there is a Kashmiri writer who has been translated by many translators, particularly prominent one from Europeans, who have translated the writer into English. And 1 year back, when I made a research on the translations, almost 10 translations that I was having written before me, I found that being Kashmiri my mother tongue, I have been able to find that there are some mistranslations that have been carried on, and I wrote a research paper. It was almost more than 2,500 words. When I submitted it in one of the prominent translation journals, and the editors, they wrote me back, rather they tried to stop me from writing that, how nobody has challenged it. For example, one of the writers, one of the translators is Grayson, Richard Temple, and they do, how you are challenging them? Then I was in a fix, how I am not able to challenge them, mean that whatever they write, whatever they translate, that is right. So is that we have not been able to come out of that neo-colonial legacy, and Europe makes us think as they want to make us think.
Sure. I agree. Dr. Shaukat Ali, it's a comment that you have made. Yes, we are in that situation, but I think that should not frustrate us, because we need to gather our resources and then try to do a different kind of work among us, and then generate new kind of audiences. That is necessary. That's very much necessary. So I would strongly recommend that you won't give up your translation, but continue to reflect on that and then continue to do that work. That's important. That's very important. I thought somebody, Deepika Singh, wanted to ask a question.
Yes, sir. Hello.
Good morning, sir. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes, sir. So
Yes,
I come.
Deepika Singh.
Yeah, yes, sir. So I come from the. Yeah, I come from the discipline of communication, sir. I've been a researcher and teacher in the area for the past 10 years, and your lecture really made me think about whether there are some Indian traditions in the area of communication studies. I have, as a researcher and as a teacher, I've been following all Western. So it really made me think whether it exists. If yes, how I can go about it as a researcher, and of course, how I can include it in my syllabus as well when I teach communication to my students.
Absolutely. I mean, oh my God, there is so much. My lecture is entirely about communicational technologies at one point. That is to say, the pneumocultural aspect is something that is very peculiar to India, but also it is Asian and African. You can come across that. That is to say, from Indian location, it should be possible for us to think more vigorously and more creatively about communicational technologies, and actually begin to engage with European thinkers, major European thinkers, and begin to point out the limitations of their theorization. That should emerge from this location. And then these cultural technologies, which are speech and gesture, performativity, these are powerful communicational technologies that are available, cultural technologies that are living, and I think it is important for us to draw on them and then begin to learn to reflect on them in a more general way and engage with European thinkers. If you contact me offline, then certainly I'll try to extend the communication with you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Good morning,
Hello.
sir.
So excuse me, this will be the last. Good morning, sir. Okay, this is the last question.
Hello.
Okay.
Good morning.
Yes, who is on? Yeah.
Myself, Mahesh Tripathi from Uttarakhand.
Yes, please.
The title Literary Inquiries Across Culture is in itself quite interesting and fascinating. And the title prompted me to pose a question. Sir, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned in your discourse that the concept of university was started by European or Europe. Am I right, sir?
University. Yes.
The concept. Sir, but the first university and the oldest university is Takshashila University.
I know. Yeah, I know that question comes up. I wish I had time to talk more about it. We use the term university without understanding what university is when we talk about Takshashila and Nalanda. Nalanda is often treated as a university. And Nalanda was called a Vihara. Nalanda Vihara, remember? And then the university has a very, very distinctive kind of baggage, conceptual baggage, with which it emerges, both in medieval Europe, but more importantly, modern Europe. Medieval Europe is 11th century in many countries in Europe, but the modern university is Germany, Berlin in 1808 or 1809, modern university emerges. They draw on very, very distinctive Christian background, and that's very crucial, that needs to be remembered. Whereas Nalanda Mahavihara was a very different one. I could have talked more about Nalanda, but unfortunately time doesn't permit. So before we use the concepts, we need to, for example, we use the word anuvada to translation, to render the word translation. Anuvada did not mean translation at all. Anuvada meant saying something after. Anuvad, this comes in the Vedic recitational context. Okay, when one particular kind of reciter of a Vedic mantra, when one recites it, some other one follows that and repeats it. That is called anuvak. Anuvada is anuvak. Anu is after. Something that follows after. So we have rendered this into translation. Whereas the word translation comes from a very strong Semitic biblical background, biblical context it comes from. So we don't understand the cultural reflective baggage which these terms carry. And we simply tend to render them superficially. That's where the problem is. The task of student of literature is to penetrate into the depth of the language. That is reflective depth, and explore that. That is needed. And we have, to a certain extent, into Indian languages that background, but we are not using that to encounter and engage with European background. That's what is needed from us. Okay.
Sir, what is
What is that?
Sir, please your contact number or ID.
My email ID. Okay, I'll type it for you right away.
Sir, what is modern today? Will it become obsolete and outdated?
I'll do the lecture now. I think this time is up now.
And I would like to thank Professor Venkat Rao for his extremely wide-ranging and erudite lecture. I'm sure that all the teachers from around India have got more resources now for further research from this lecture. It was amazing and a very inspiring lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you for your patience and questions. Thank you.